Uh, Thank you again. Thank you. We'll start momentarily. If you want, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're from. Also, tell us if you've already signed a digital or physical pledge card in support of the Fair Share Amendment, which you should if you haven't already, and I will drop into the chat. And for those who aren't familiar yet, although I'm sure many of you are, it's the Millionaire's Tax Ballot Initiative to raise put a 4% surtax on income above $1 million with dedicated funding for education and transportation. And why we don't have like such a thing already is in many ways directly relevant to the discussion we're having today. But again, thank you all for being here, and I'll get us started probably in about 2 minutes. I will get streaming established for this while I'm doing that. Okay, I think that we will be going live in 1 and 2, and I believe we are now live. So I will kick us off with that and let people in as folks continue to stroll in. So quick, thank you all for joining this evening. Many of you know me. If you don't, my name is Jonathan Cohn. I chair the Issues Committee here with Progressive Massachusetts. I'm delighted to have with us this evening Lily Geismer, author of the book that we'll be discussing this evening, Don't Blame Us, as well as Tracy Novick, kind of an education policy expert. I'll give a quick framing and then introduce both of them, hand it off to Tracy to do some kind of Q&A with Dr. Geismer, and then open it toward the end for any questions from folks joining us. Kind of Dr. Geismer's book I read back in 2016, which was a great book looking at kind of when you think about Massachusetts as a state where we are never lacking in good intentions, yet somehow our state remains one of the most unequal in the country. And the question of how can you have that juxtaposition, that dichotomy that exists? How efforts at fair housing not actually lead to any real change in the kind of housing landscape of the state, why we can, as well as the many other ways in which battles over the years at addressing issues often left the structural foundations of inequality intact. In the book, which I thought was a great way of explaining some things I had questions about how we got to where we are here in Massachusetts, as well as the ability to have incisive reflections then about how we can get to where we need to go. I'll just do a quick intro of both of them. And so Dr. Lily Geismer is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College, where she teaches and researches about recent political and urban history with a focus on liberalism and the Democratic Party. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Jacobin, Dissent, and NPR, and other podcasts. A native of Massachusetts, she currently resides in Los Angeles. And then when I was thinking of earlier, I was like, I would love to hear Dr. Geismer talk more about her book, because it just kind of such a useful kind of framework even to think about Massachusetts, the political culture here, and as well as how it contributed to national changes in the Democratic Party and the country's political culture. And I was thinking of whom I would like who would be a good interviewer to help facilitate the discussion. And then I thought of Tracy, because Tracy had done this really good thread on Twitter that was last year when she was reading through the book. And I thought, do you know who would have really good questions and could facilitate this well? Tracy. So to introduce Tracy O'Connell Novick, professionally works on school policy and finance for the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. She is, let me just quickly admit somebody. She's currently serving her fourth non-sequential term on the Worcester School Committee, and the rest of the time is probably tweeting about some of the above. A nearly lifetime Massachusetts resident, she taught high school English and history before spending several years at home with children, becoming a licensed school business administrator during her time with the association. She lives in Worcester with her husband, 3 daughters, and cat Harry, who at 10 p.m. sharp appears on any Zoom meetings happening in the house. So we will not be there long enough to see Harry, but maybe. But with that introduction, again, I will hand it over to both of you and take myself off spotlight, and then for some discussion and then Q&A. And if you have questions during it, feel free to chime into the chat as well. But take it away.
Excellent. So yeah, as Jonathan said, I actually cracked the book open just about the time that we were sort of shutting everything down. And so then spent this sort of extensive Twitter thread shouting about the book and how everyone else should be reading it during the pandemic too. So I'm super excited. As the kids would say, I have absolutely no chill about this book. So I know Dr. Geismer offered to just give us sort of an encapsulation of the book for those of you who either might have read it a while ago or might not have gotten through it yet. Roberto, I'm intentionally not calling you out here. Just to sort of get us all on the same ground.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored, and I feel like you've set up a high bar, both of you, for me to reach. But one thing that's really nice about doing this talk is when I generally speak about this book, it's about to national audiences who don't really know Massachusetts and aren't necessarily interested in the ins and outs of the Massachusetts story. So it's really lovely to get to get into some of the sort of weeds on the Massachusetts side of this. But I thought it would be useful just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of the project, and then sort of to begin our discussion. So the book, my book, Don't Blame Us, looks at the professionals who lived and worked along the Route 128 corridor between the 1950s and 1980s to show the reorientation and transformation of modern liberalism and the Democratic Party away from working class union members in urban areas and towards suburban knowledge workers. And I focus primarily on 5 Route 128 communities: Lexington, Concord, Lincoln, Newton, and Brookline, and the priorities and activities of the residents who live there. And I saw that when people were introducing themselves, there's many people from those communities here, which is exciting. And so I'm curious to sort of hear how much it speaks to kind of today as opposed to the sort of history of it. But what I wanted to look at by understanding the kind of the grassroots political mobilization and priorities of residents in these communities is how they're understanding the sort of dimensions of their politics, especially their focus on middle-class suburban-centered priorities like high quality of life, low taxes, freedom of choice, equality of opportunity, meritocracy, especially education as a means to advancement, and using expertise and technocratic approaches to problems. The ways in which these politics actually came to sort of shape national politics. So what they represented about what was changing within the Democratic Party and liberals. And I should say one of the things that sort of interested me was to looking at Massachusetts was that Massachusetts is so often sort of considered an exception to politics, that and it's really part of the kind of ethos of Massachusetts exceptionalism, but in the national sort of ethos is this idea of Massachusetts being different. And I wanted to actually understand what it could represent about these broader changes. And so what I found in my research is that suburban liberals in these communities mobilized for a range of liberal, social, and political causes. And there's this assumption, especially amongst kind of scholars, I think this is in the news too, that people who live in the suburbs are kind of apolitical, or if they're political, they're conservative. And I was sort of complicating that idea. So I found research of people being very active around issues of fair housing, voluntary integration, launching, we're sort of at the heart really of founding the METCO program, issues of peace, opposition to the Vietnam War, campaigns for liberal politicians like George McGovern, feminism, and around taxes and then high-tech growth. And what I wanted to sort of show is that these all demonstrated a particular type of liberalism that was focused on equal opportunity, high quality of life, rational solutions to problems, and working through the legal and political system to create equality. And it also reflected the sort of class identity and priorities of these affluent suburbanites as well. And I looked at how those types of priorities actually became implemented into reflected larger national politics that prioritized suburban residents, but then actually came to shape politics and policy. And the thing that I found that's the most sort of central to, and I think is the most interesting, is kind of these suburban liberal activists were the most effective in and achieved their greatest victories on campaigns that proposed individual solutions to rights-related issues, required limited financial sacrifice, and offered tangible quality of life benefits. So things like fair housing, voluntary integration, environmentalism, peace, politics, and feminism. And issues that threatened entitlements of homeownership, such as property values, tax rates, and children's education, became least successful. This became most clear in issues around affordable housing and two-way busing. So there's really fierce battles within all of these communities, especially around issues of affordable housing. And so I sort of found that this is, I always describe this as the kind of the furthest away you got from someone's pocketbook, especially their property taxes, children's education, and property values. The more liberal people in the suburbs were as closer as you got to those kinds of issues, the more you saw a lot of resistance. And so the question that I had, the sort of main thing I wanted to show is that this contributed to both the persistence of liberalism in the Democratic Party. So it's actually these become the kind of base of the Democratic Party, and also the persistence of racial and structural inequality, both in Massachusetts and in the United States, and in particular. And sort of how these actually came to, in some ways, fortify those structures of racial and racial and economic inequity. So it's sort of part of the kind of the larger structures that are very much sort of at the heart of Massachusetts and many other kinds of communities. And that is kind of persistent. So that's sort of the overview of the book. I hope that helps, and I'm happy to answer questions on some of the specific issues that I discuss or different campaigns as well. Oh, I think you're on mute, Tracy.
There we go. That's excellent. So as I said, I've been sort of telling everyone who has any involvement in Massachusetts politics for the past year that they absolutely need to read this book. As Jonathan was saying, it sort of explains so many of kind of the structural questions that I think a lot of us have who are active in Massachusetts politics in various ways. And I guess my first question was, what drove you to even write about this? What caused you to ask this question?
Sure. Well, one of the things, I mean, so historians work on books for a really long time, and this started out as actually my dissertation. And I began it working on it in 2004 and 2005. And one of the things is that sort of at that point, how I describe this is that it was right after John Kerry's election, which now seems like a quaint moment in like American history, but in American political history. But at the time, there was all this discussion of kind of like Massachusetts liberals, and that like John Kerry had lost because he was this big Massachusetts liberal. And that fascinated me in the fact that I had grown up in Massachusetts and I'd heard all of this to sort of discuss, like, and it didn't really, this idea of kind of Massachusetts being so liberal was not really what I knew. I mean, I knew the Democratic Party was very active, but the question that I really had is how could this place that's considered so liberal also be the most racially segregated place in the United States? I mean, I think, and that's another thing that just sort of the immense segregation of Massachusetts was something that really sort of fascinated me. So to sort of probe that contradiction. And I think one of the things that that I wanted to really understand is that there's this narrative of Massachusetts exceptionalism, that it's like the most liberal place ever. It's sort of part of its ethos. It's better than everywhere else. Like, and and my husband who's from LA will say I probably fall in line with that thinking sometimes. But like I wanted to sort of understand about what that narrative actually obscures about the reality of the place, about Massachusetts and its sort of political and structural identity. And so how this notion of its liberalness is actually sort of underlying these deeper structural conditions. And part of it was that, and that sort of drove me to sort of think about these kind of suburban communities and sort of think about the other question there too, was that there was also at the time, I think this is a little, I mean, obviously it's different, but in the 2000s, there was just really the sense that like kind of that liberalism, the Democratic Party was done. And I was interested in this question of like, where had it moved and sort of who has become the base of the party. And that is really these suburban kind of knowledge workers. And what does it mean that their priorities are driving the Democratic Party? What is that leaving out? And that was another sort of issue. And I think another thing about studying Massachusetts was the fact that the sort of high-tech post-industrial economy is so strong in Massachusetts, but also that the suburbs actually play a really outsized role in state politics. And so that was one thing that I kind of wanted to understand, is like that they actually have this really driving force. That I don't think this is the way people think about Massachusetts, but it's actually a heavily suburbanized state. And so what that reflects about its broader political identity. That was a long answer to your question, but that's what drove me to do it.
No, I'm glad to have it.
I mean, come from like a love of the suburbs. Like I wasn't like, I like.
No, and actually, I mean, part of the reason I asked is I'm a Massachusetts native too, and actually I was born in Concord during the period of the book that you're writing. So from my perspective, you're kind of telling the story of when I was growing up. I didn't grow up in Concord. I grew up a little sort of the other side of 495. But that whole, from Proposition 2.5 happening when I was in elementary school to the Massachusetts high-tech boom, to like all of those things are actually things I grew up with. And to have them then put in this political context of, what does that have to do with the bumper stickers that I actually do remember still seeing on people's cars of "Don't blame us, we're from Massachusetts," with the map, right, that only had Massachusetts for McGovern. So that that itself was just interesting to me personally. But then as someone who does policy, that question of suburbs, and actually that leads me to my next question, which is that I picked up the book in March. I had it for a little bit, and then we went. And actually, there's this. If you follow my thread on Twitter, like I literally picked it up like the first week of March, and then didn't get back to it to the first week of April, which tells you everything about what education policy was doing in Massachusetts during that time. But part of what I was reflecting on as I read the book was how much of the state's response to the pandemic was actually effectively kind of more, again, of an outgrowth of that. We're largely politically a suburban state. And over again, there sort of was this state focus on the experience, in particular of the Metro Boston suburbs. And I mean, really the suburbs, not the urban areas there. Ignoring the experiences of the cities or sort of dismissing the experience of the cities. This ongoing lip service to equity that didn't end up ever causing any pain or discomfort to the comfortable, really was what I think a lot of us, I mean, I live in Worcester, saw playing out over the course of the pandemic. And I just wondered if that wasn't only true here, it was true other places as well. I just wondered what you might have to say about that in terms of this sort of last 18 months that we've experienced.
I mean, it's fascinating. And it's really wonderful to hear that you found the book. I guess it's not wonderful that it spoke to that, but I mean, it's because it clearly wasn't on my mind, but that it has kind of this persistent thing. And I think it is true that like the suburbs get within the sort of political culture of the state, and it really in its systems of governance get prioritized over and over again. And that's kind of who has the loudest voices in some capacity. And sort of who is seen as kind of needing to be in some ways placated. And I think you sort of see that. So that's where the sort of these things, and also just like speak out. And so that was one thing that I was sort of that, like, I always say that, like, looking to sort of suburban liberals, as the book does, like they're actually a tiny piece of like Massachusetts or the national story, but they play an outsized political role. I mean, in the number of things, even in the national discussion, this is even pre the pandemic, but like, if you look at the discussions around the 2020 election, suburban voters were getting just disproportionate amounts of political attention from the media and from politicians, from Trump's comments about the destroying the suburbs on, but I think that actually speaks to this kind of this sort of place. And so when that, I think we often think about that in terms of politics, but that actually plays itself out very much in terms of policy too, and has really long-term repercussions. And that's one thing that I really wanted to understand. And I think someone asked, and I saw a quick thing sort of fly by in the chat, but I think one thing that's does make Massachusetts slightly different in some capacity than other types of places is the long history of resistance to annexation. And so that the fact that the city of Boston is quite, so there's some of these things that are like in a long history of kind of it's the sort of politics of the city, but like that the city of Boston is very small in proportion, and that you have it's surrounded by these suburban communities who've effectively choked it off in terms of resources. And so unlike LA, which annexed a large part of its suburban communities, that affects kind of how policy gets sort of done, and actually also where resources lie. And so the other question I had, I mean, I saw this briefly come up, but like the book actually looks extensively at the history of these suburbs, which have extraordinarily restrictive zoning policies. And so that in these places that are very purportedly liberal, have really, really exclusionary zoning. And that's affected things in all kinds of ways that I think do that come to play themselves out in things like the pandemic. And I think, it's sort of like becomes like a sort of window, or you see those inequities really sort of see themselves, they become magnified in moments of crisis.
And the chat didn't let me down. I was waiting for someone to pick on Brookline, and Roberto went there because I knew there was a chat going on Twitter just the other day, by the way. So as most of you know, Brookline is actually part of Norfolk County. It's not part of Suffolk County, which means that when we come out with a county map and those are in two different places in terms of how they're doing with COVID, you then once again see that, oh, look, Brookline is completely surrounded by Suffolk County, which is exactly that story, of course.
Yeah, and they're the first, actually, Brookline, for those for like the deep dive of the history, is the first suburb to resist annexation in the country, and sets off a chain reaction both in Boston but also nationally. And so that's, I mean, that's an issue too about sort of thinking about northern versus southern cities, or southern and western cities that all most of those annex their suburbs, versus the Northeast where that did not happen. And I think, or St. Louis is another classic example of this happening. But it also leads to like intense political fragmentation, which I think has all kinds of effects too. I mean, that you have this of like, that you have, and you all probably know this more than I can speak to this way more than I can of your organizing experiences. I think it affects organizing in a lot of different ways. And I also think it affects things like that you have like 60 different school committees. So trying to make things like pandemic policy is nearly impossible because you have to deal with like, as opposed to, and I'm not like a all pro centralized bureaucracy or anything, but like, I do think that affects the ability of certain, where this tradition of localism has actually led to certain kinds of like deep inequities within the state of Massachusetts and Massachusetts politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so because the state, I won't go off on too much of a long school committee tangent here, but because the state effectively ducked the decision about what we're doing in terms of our pandemic policy for fall, every single school committee in Massachusetts now has to have that conversation. And one of the conversations that school committees were having this afternoon is, well, why would you need to know what other school committees are doing? And I don't know, I'm in Worcester, which is actually a pretty good sized community, but half of our teachers live outside of the city. So yeah, exactly. Which actually leads into my next question. There really is, as you mentioned, there's so much of the book that ends up coming back to this notion of protecting not really real children or specific children so much as this sort of idealized white suburban childhood idea. And certainly it extends into Metco, which, we always have to preface this is the longest voluntary desegregation effort in the country. It's about 3,000 kids. We've got about 1 million kids in Massachusetts. But also, it comes up in the battle over zoning. It comes up when they're talking about nuclear disarmament. Certainly the war in Vietnam, when there's that disparity of what happens to a boy in Roxbury versus a boy in one of the suburbs. And even the extension of the red line, right, of how, we need to make sure we protect our children. We can't have people being able to come out here. But then you have a couple of these really poignant places in the book where you directly start quoting children. I mean, I particularly think of effectively sort of that second strike that took place in Boston, where the suburban children actually came into the city and effectively kind of ran a desegregated school district for a Saturday, where the suburban white children are not actually being necessarily represented by the views of their parents, or purportedly their parents, so to speak. And I'd love to hear you talk about sort of that dichotomy, or even what that ends up meaning of this sort of fight over this idealized again white childhood.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and one that I think about. I mean, it's fascinating to me about this way that children get talked about. And I think the other side of that too is like the way that children of color are addressed too, and this sort of notion of like what this like. There's often this sort of paternalistic idea of like what is good for children of color, which I think you see in especially in the MECO program brings that up more and more. But this will be like bad for children in some capacity, or like look what we're offering. But in various different ways, like let's protect children. I think from the sort of thinking about it as like the sort of white phenomenon has to do with the fact that so many parents, and particularly, and this is in a place of the communities I looked at, one of the reasons I picked them is that one of the reasons they were all the earliest became earliest involved in METCO. But the other thing is they're all places that really prioritize education. And so, are willing to sort of make that's the big reason that a lot of people move to those particular communities. I think that's still true today, but it was especially true in the 1950s and 60s. So like the number one thing, like why you want to live in Newton is that like the schools are really good. And that's something that people are willing to sort of make other kinds of sacrifices for, but then that becomes really protective. Like I'm doing these types of things for my child. And I think that kind of shapes politics in all kinds of ways. And the really interesting question about that's a place where sort of this transcends partisanship, and that it's about kind of suburban centered identity. So I think that that's something that's true of like Republican suburbanites too, are predominant, like also have this idea of kind of they're doing things for their children. But I think it manifests in a particular kind of these sort of liberal ideals about kind of like sort of equal opportunity, but not actually trying to make the kinds of material sacrifices such to create the types of equity that would actually create some sort of racial equality or something like that, or socioeconomic equality. So I think it's a place where sort of the pivot point, but I do think there's a disconnect of how children themselves are actually responding to this. I will say, I mean, I've grappled with this a lot though, because their benefit, like I didn't do lots of like ethnographic interviews, but like oftentimes when I would describe people when I was working on this book, like what I was doing, I would say that I wrote about the MECO program, because that was like immediately predominant. It's a one piece of the bigger project. But that I think that many white students actually did find like MECO a transformative experience. So it's easy to be sort of dismissive of it in a lot of ways, but I do think it actually, like for many people, it does offer certain kinds of things. It's just profoundly limited in what it does. Like it's not the solution to socioeconomic and racial equity in Massachusetts, but it does offer the individual children who are involved in it certain, like many different types of things, both Black and white children. And so it's often sort of important to kind of keep that in mind.
Right. And actually, that's in keeping with some of the conversations that I've seen online. And, so I'm like every other mom who's out there, which means that I'm in, Facebook groups and chats online of that kind of thing. And of course, the latest thing that came out was, here we all are. Professor Oster's new book is out, which means that now we all have to talk about individualistic parenting, right? And one of the things that I was reflecting on, which there was a paper that the professor shared today, which was the response of parents to the pandemic in terms of race and class and gender, and their willingness to effectively make sacrifices for the greater good. Like if it doesn't actually directly benefit your child, are you willing to do it? And I saw that really in line with what you were writing.
Yeah, and I think this is something I think about all the time. And I think it's a critical component of the book is like how to get people to care about other people's kids. And I think that's like, and it's a lot of things get done because I care about my child. But like to actually say like, I'm going to give this up because it's good for someone else's child, like for other children is very, very, it seems to me just like this impenetrable thing. And I think that's the place like, and so in these places, the book, if for those of you who didn't read it, like goes through the fights that happened about MECO during the busing crisis and the recession. And it was like, I don't want to spend like an extra dollar on my like pay an extra $1 a year in property taxes because it could like benefit other children like that, or that it could somehow hurt my child's education because the schools will become overcrowded or something like that. Like those are the places I think that you really see that come out. And I think it's been such a like the pandemic has brought this up in such stark contrast of like the sort of overwhelming support for Black Lives Matter in suburban communities, which is like, it is like quite striking that how it's out there, but at the same time, all the other sort of protective measures that are being taken to really hyper individualist things for my own child's education. And so the conversations around equity have just sort of like, it just feels really, it feels so kind of blinkered. I don't actually think it's a contradiction. I think these are things that are like fundamentally structured into sort of the both suburban political culture and suburban political economy in a lot of affluent communities.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, that sort of the distance away from, what is right here. And of course, I think for most parents, there's nothing that's closer than your child. And as soon as there's any threat to that, then suddenly, all of the rest of it goes out the window. As I said earlier, one of the things that I found in reading the book as a Massachusetts native, where there were these moments, and I've sort of shouted about them on Twitter, of where I was like, oh, that explains it, right? So like the Mass High Technology Council being involved in the Prop 2.5 battle, that's the first place where Charlie Baker worked when he got into graduate school. Oh, okay, wait, that explains so much. The anti-snob zoning literally being passed by the Boston reps as payback for the Racial Inequality Act. And I was like, damn, like that's just like everything you need to know about Boston and the suburbs, like right there, right? And also, you answered a question. And honestly, so I've lived in Massachusetts all my life. I literally did not realize when Boston went through desegregation until I was probably in my 30s, that it actually had happened during my own lifetime. I, much like everybody else, right, that was something that happened a long time ago. But my parents were offered the chance to inherit a brownstone from my father's uncle, which was in Charlestown in the early 80s. And I remember my mother, like, she never explained it, but her just saying, oh, well, we couldn't possibly do that. We wouldn't go there. Well, of course, what was most vivid in my mother from upstate New York's mind, it was the pictures of the buses being met with bottles and rocks. Were there moments where you, again, as someone who grew up in Massachusetts, you had those sort of like, oh, kind of moments when you were actually doing your research or writing the book?
I mean, one of the most basic too, like I thought METCO started during the desegregation, was a response to the Boston busing crisis and the fact that it's 10 years earlier, and that it was sort of launched in many ways by kind of suburban liberals and in partnership within Afro-Americans in Roxbury. So that was like a surprising story to me. I think that there was a lot of things about the kind of mythology of the state that just sort of like that kept coming up. I mean, the most interesting like aha moment to me actually was really early. And this wasn't from being a Massachusetts native, but just like sort of fascinating, is that this project actually launched from looking at knowing about a fair housing campaign. So an African American tried to move into the suburbs move into Lexington, and was blocked from doing so. And I had read about there was a CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, held a protest at the Minuteman statue. And I had assumed that the people protesting would have been African American. And when I saw the picture, like I went to the archives, and the picture of that it was all white women who were doing mostly white women who were doing the protesting. That sort of fascinated me about the kind of the way that who was involved in these kind of liberal campaigns. Those were things that sort of just, I guess, like shocked and surprised me. And I'm trying to think other things that just like, it's like fascinating to sort of think about. And I do think the fact that high tech, the predominant role of high tech, which I think is something, and that's something that I became increasingly interested in as I was doing the research for this project. But I think it's so much a kind of silent component and driving force of the kind of culture and politics of Metro Boston, but doesn't always get sort of addressed or talked about. So that was really fascinating to me to like sort of think through more critically. I guess those are the places that I was most interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, and I'm glad you raised those pictures, because first of all, I was picking on Concord and Lexington because basically every single time they're going to have a protest, it's going to be on Battle Green, or you're going to be at the Minuteman statue. Like, we're not giving up our revolutionary history. But also one of the things I was thinking about, because particularly once you started talking about sort of the growth of second wave feminism, right? So I'm a Smith College grad, so that's sort of like the Seven Sisters graduate, marry, and go do good works if they can afford it in the suburbs, right? Until we get to the 1970s and women start going into the workforce. Which, by the way, I feel like I'm not making enough quips on school committees, because you have that line about who they're quoting during school committee meetings. And I was like, damn, I'm letting people down. But I also was thinking of it in terms of the book Mothers of Massive Resistance, where it's a movement of largely white Southern women that actually do this sort of giant organizing against the desegregation of the schools in the South. And a lot of that kind of work. And again, of that sort of, energy of women, white women who were at home, and again, organizing very oftentimes around issues that they saw in some way aligning with their interests up to a point of their children.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of it's a critical kind of component of the kind of history of in a number of different ways, but of women's activism. And there's this idea, I think there's such a sort of assumption of like post-war women being all the Betty Friedan, like bored suburban house, like depressed suburban housewife. And like for many women, like they found meaning and work through becoming politically organized and like finding sort of, I think both in issues that they cared about, but also sort of community. And I do think that it was that the effect that like when the book looks at sort of the dissipation of a lot of these liberal campaigns came from women going back into the workforce and just not having time to work on those things. And I think that like maintains in it, like it becomes is a continued issue that you need to have a lot of time and resources to be able to do political organizing, and that kind of that when you have to work to it becomes just more challenging. So that's kind of one of the other side of those, having that sort of that freedom, I guess, and sort of finding different meaning. So I was like inspired by a lot of those stories.
Mm-hmm. And there also are a couple of places where there's sort of the distinction between the times where they actually organize either with or in parallel with very frequently Black activists in, say, Roxbury and Mattapan and parts of Boston, and the times where they're not actually drawn in, and what difference that ends up making in terms of both the success of, but also the long-term impacts of what they're deciding on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. And I think there's some things, there's sort of dimensions of like on what campaigns or what issues sort of speak to, can transcend particular boundaries. And on other things are not part of the kind of relevant experience. And so much of it, I do think so much of kind of activism and organizing is about sort of what personally appeals to you. And I think also like you're going to get like material benefits from. Mm-hmm. So those become much different, like fighting against, I'm trying to think, the example is about like sort of around issues around welfare is not that particularly appealing to white suburban women in the suburbs, whereas the Equal Rights Amendment is. So that's one of those distinctions.
Right. So, you give us sort of some pieces of hope at the end of the book in terms of, where can we go from here? As those of us who are, attempting to organize and make change in Massachusetts. And as you note, I think the story that most often is not told about Massachusetts is how heavily segregated the state is. I keep saying this about school districts, and if you're only from here and only know our system, you just think this is how everybody is, and it's not. But what kinds of hope would you offer? What kinds of ways forward would you propose and suggest?
Well, I guess like hope. I'm trying to think of places of hope. The biggest thing I always say is these questions around sort of how the fact that a lot of these things came from policies, and that's like that if policies made them, policies can change them. And so that's like what I tell my students about where I gather hope from, and like why I became drawn to kind of thinking about policy. One of the things from the book is that like, and this goes to actually thinking of people like in Mothers of Mass Resistance too, is that a small number of organized people can actually do a lot. And so one thing that if you sort of look at I trace like all of these kind of groups were able to actually change policy in various different kinds of way or pass laws and types of things. And so I think it shows like the power of doing kind of organizing campaigns can actually do things with using the right kind of tools. So those are things that like give me a sense of hope that like it's possible to create particular that like the tools are there. And I that's where I gather some hope from.
That's great. So those are all the questions that I have. And so I'm happy it looks like you all have largely been kind of almost answering each other in the chat. But I'm trying to figure out whether or not there are any questions that we necessarily missed. Lots of conversation around zoning and property taxes for sure. So can you draw a connect? I would think we'll take maybe finish this question here. It looks like, can you draw a connection between Massachusetts political deference to sort of liberal suburbs on one side and our long tradition of insular leadership dominated state house politics and Republican governors on the other?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One of the things in the book looks at this. I mean, I think that this is a fascinating thing about kind of Massachusetts politics is this kind of bifurcated approach. And this is another thing I was actually interested in looking at was that, so when I started the book, Mitt Romney was governor, but this long tradition of Massachusetts governors. So there's a tradition of a lot of communities, split ticket voting, of voting liberal in state elections, and then voting Republican on state elections, and nationally, and for Democrats on national issues. And like a lot of the suburban communities I looked at showed that kind of that politics, which I think has to do with this idea that Republicans are more fiscally responsible. This response to kind of, there's a particular kind of Republican who's done quite well in Massachusetts around who's kind of, who is sort of has a business background, is technocratic. I think Charlie Baker like absolutely fits that fold of like, it's not surprising to me. And that has kind of this idea that he's allowing other things to happen. So like he's protecting people's taxes, keeping state taxes low, doing all these other kinds of things. And that like enables you to kind of be liberal on national issues that don't actually affect those types of things. And so it fits into the kind of dynamics that I see. I think that there's this idea, this kind of dismissal of the state house, at least like, so in the activists I looked at, there's kind of an idea that like you use state politics and you need it, but that it is dominated by like this kind of Irish, this old kind of like Irish working class. So like Mike Dukakis comes from a tradition of kind of reforming Massachusetts state politics. Like there was always idea that it was like corrupt and like insular. And so it's like a necessary evil to some capacity. So when you work through that system, but I think like the activists and different kinds of groups are like using a lot of different mechanisms such to get at what they want. And so sometimes they work through state politics and they need to, sometimes it's national politics and it's local politics. It's sort of, it works in a couple different ways, but I think that is like a kind of hindrance, to the state. I think that just kind of comes from its like sort of particular political traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you said, again, that's sort of the not even bifurcation, the tiny communities that we have that people are split up into.
Yeah, and I also think there's just not I mean, many places state politics is not an arena that they pay a lot of attention to. And I mean, this is true nationally. It's like actually where the Republicans have been really successful, was a kind of ignoring of state politics in the last, over the last like 30 years. And then now they dominate all these state houses. In Massachusetts, this is not necessarily true in Massachusetts, it's a slightly different tradition, but like that's, we look at all these bills that are getting passed. A lot of that is that I think the Democratic Party has actually really, really ignored what's happening at the state level. And so that has affected these like those kinds of things at all. And now you can see it does hold a lot of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually I was thinking of that when in the chapter where you talk about Proposition 2.5 passing, I know I've run into people who have said, well, why do we still have Proposition 2.5? And you point out that our communities are small enough where if you are that kind of community, you can actually create the capacity to do a 2.5 override. And that there you then explain the split between the cities and the towns in terms of the foundation budget, among other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge one. And you sort of say, I'll go to my, and it's also really, I think the other thing, like, and many of you probably know this from just working on things, it's very hard to repeal things once they're passed. And so I think especially with things like, I think I see this with Prop 2.5, and I don't even know, but like living in California with Prop 13, which is widely unpopular. I mean, if you actually like talk to people, they grumble about it all the time, but like even the one that was trying to get rid of the loophole went down. And like, it's impossible. It's been very, very challenging to overcome those types of policies. And I think in Massachusetts, you have this, like, I do think the carve outs or the overrides actually have actually abetted that from not getting a full and not being able to repeal. There's not more opposition to it. And I think in many, it's this idea that we just like sort of, I mean, I'd say we, but like people just live with it. Like that's kind of what happened. Like there was lots of opposition to Prop 2.5 when it was after it was passed. And then like 2 years later, it's like we just have to sort of made our peace with it. I think in California, the same thing with Prop 13. Like, and there's not a question of like, I mean, I always talk to my students about this, but like why because California is a slight tangent, but like why your public schools like sucked, or why you had this big like private foundation next to your attached to your public school. But they talked to their parents about repealing, and they went home to whenever they talked to their parents about it, they're like, well, we would never repeal it. So there's that kind of element.
Mm-hmm.
That's my
sure, right. Because and again, it's one of those where the places that necessarily potentially have the oomph or have the power can actually make it work for them. So why would you change it, right? Yeah. So we've got a couple of people who are asking about the suburbanization of poverty, in terms of the growing amount of poverty that's happening in the suburbs, and what impacts do you potentially see that having, or what sort of changes or shifts might that make?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, so this isn't a question like when I talk to sort of national audiences about the national suburban politics, like one of the things that's really fascinating is like the way, so in the last election cycle, there was all this discussion of the suburbs, and it wasn't this recognition the suburbs have changed tremendously nationally as to what they look like. And there is this huge issue of like, there's more poverty in the suburbs than in cities. There's so many people who found cities unaffordable. I think that the danger is to then sort of say like, it's not like the suburbs are this like suddenly become this utopia, and you still see segregation within suburban communities. So like, I'll like rag on Lexington, but like Lexington is still quite maintains its kind of affluence, but you have other sort of suburban communities that are having a lot of difficulties, and one is not coming to my mind. I mean, technically, like I guess Chelsea or Lynn are suburbs, and so that like you see a real disparity going on between there. But I think it's a major issue, and I think there's just not the attention to it that it deserves. Because one of the things is that these many suburban communities that are communities that are becoming increasingly sort of housing lower income people just don't have the infrastructure and capacity to deal with issues of poverty and inequality. And so I think that in some ways, like many cities have social services set up such to address those kinds of issues, and like a lot of those are non-existent. And especially, and the other issue is like the massive problems of transportation that traditionally suburban communities don't have. I mean, in Massachusetts is somewhat more concentrated, so there is a slight more access to some transportation, but not to the degree that it could that could happen. So I think that's an issue.
Yes, speaking of that, by the way, if no one on this session ever, picks up the "if Newton can't do it, who on earth can" motto and runs with that, I mean, that would be a shame, y'all. You really should use that again.
Yeah, I mean, and it is true. It's like the major issue. I mean, the major issue of how to deal with these types of questions, and I think this is this issue, and this goes to zoning or to other types of things, but is like, I think in some ways there's this issue of history repeating itself. And I was just looking at the New York Times article about what's going on in Charlottesville, but it actually was like where they're at in the aftermath of the protests there, and then Black Lives Matter. I mean, all this sort of stuff the last 4 years, they're really trying to take that to heart, and that's gone to sort of changing their zoning policies and trying to make space for more affordable housing, and that there's like fierce resistance to it. And that felt to me the most like sort of echoes of what came in my book. And the reality is that like in all these places like Newton, that came in the aftermath of the urban uprisings of the 1960s. I mean, the communities were responding to that and saying, we have to do something. And there's really fierce resistance. And I think it's like in that is the place that if you want to create, one of the key places, if you want to create socioeconomic equity, like affordable housing is a place to do it. And I think it's actually the hardest battle. And that's the one that I like, that's really where you see resistance to it.
Right. And I mean, I know that there are people on here who even have commented before about, as you say, the people who have the Black Lives Matter sign and also have the sign that's opposing whatever the affordable housing project is. I mean, that's become definitely a trope across, a lot of the communities here, and also some that are right next to it. Right. So that's absolutely at what point does the political become personal, and how do you put those two signs next to each other on a lawn? Yeah. So we got a couple of people who are asking about particular books. So I don't want to necessarily assume. So we've got, how do the lessons of your book fit into the narrative of Drained Pool Politics by Heather McGee? And if these don't ring bells, that's totally cool. They don't necessarily to me, but I don't read everything.
Sure. I did read her book, The Sum of Us. I was sort of thinking about how to this idea of draining. I mean, the metaphor of like we drain the public pool,
okay,
as opposed to
yes.
sharing it with everybody.
Yep.
I think that there's just that sort of that hyper sort of individualist politics of suburban communities of not trying to sort of share and share resources or thinking about those types of things. So I think that like in some ways, I mean, this is always the thing, like I think that like liberal people or people who have sort of liberal ideals are often the hardest to fight on those kinds of issues, or sort of as Tracy was bringing up, like the kind of contradiction of sort of having the sign up actually prevents some of that thinking. But I like have my sign. I support Black Lives Matter. Like, how dare you accuse me of not trying to open up my community to everyone? But there are many ways that these things would create. I mean, I think like both would have personal. I mean, that's one thing that Heather McGee shows, like all the kinds of ways that this would benefit in terms of like actually creating a social safety, a sound social safety net. That would benefit everybody. I mean, I think that's so I see it as sort of having a similar message, or there's similar messages about the power of sort of thinking collectively, that I think resonate in that book, or that I've tried to address in my own work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it honestly, I mean, in some ways, it also goes back to the point that was made. I was interested to read that there was a very quick early suggestion that Metco could either go in both directions or expand to become a school district, and that was sort of quickly patted. First of all, that it came from the suburban end, but then it was sort of quickly, suppressed and patted down and never went any farther.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways. I mean, I think that there'd be tremendous benefits if you had a full scale metropolitan integration program for lots of different kinds of people. But it's like a third rail. I mean, I think that's so of addressing like, how dare you bust my child? So that I mean it's and the Supreme Court is now invalidated. But those are the types of things that like there would be lots of benefits to doing a kind of full scale metropolitan integration program.
So we got, what would you suggest as a fruitful angle for local activists to sway local opinion on zoning and density?
I mean, I think it is tough. I mean, I think the environmental arguments are the ones that are the strongest for many communities. That it would, I mean, what it would do. The benefits of density, which just seem to be really challenging to people, but that there are many types of things. I mean, I think to anyone who wants to live in a socioeconomically diverse community, or a community that's open up to more people, like those are the types of ones that sort of help. But I think that those can often face resistance. And and I find my book, like I think this still goes on, that like often the arguments also fall on environmental lines, that like particular places where affordable housing is going to happen, it's often seen as having that it will have environmental consequences. So you're fighting it on two levels. But I think right now, like having housing, transit-oriented housing, I mean, that's the rub I always feel like is like in the book looks at the fight against in Lexington of the extension of the Red Line, and like the people in Lexington's property values would now have gone up if they had the Red Line there, like access to public transportation and doing housing around that's transit oriented would have all these types of benefits. So I think the ways in which this would actually benefit you or benefit your community, are kind of some of the arguments that are persuasive, and some of the general arguments don't always hold sway, because it's like, why would I make the personal sacrifice for it? I hope that, I don't know if that addresses the question, but.
Well, and I want to highlight the point that Rita's making in the chat too, which is that having less vanilla communities is actually beneficial too, and that we probably having communities that are less vanilla is also beneficial to everyone as well. And Rita, I'm glad you made that point, because so as a white college educated middle class mother who chose to send her children to the Worcester Public Schools, one of the arguments I'm always making to my peers is it's actually done amazing things for my kids. And so, you're never going to see my school district show up on a, top 10 whatever list. But in terms of the education they've gotten by virtue of being in this school district rather than the surrounding suburbs, it's never going to show up on that kind of list, but it's actually done amazing things for them as people. And those, I think, are not the conversations we probably have as much.
Well, and the reality is, like, that's the argument that affirmative action hinges on right now, which is this idea that it's good for, I mean, particularly at the college level. So like that it's good for, the reason that you can have affirmative action in colleges is that it's basically good for white students too. And like this has benefits, and that has been like a persuasive, I think it's true. And it's like there's a persuasive argument to it.
And I mean, to be fair, it also was part of the argument that was being made in the suburbs around Metco too, although there it was in sort of smaller, very controlled, carefully measured points. So let's see, there was a long thing that came through. Yeah, environmental justice being in contrast, as you said, with public housing, or being set up to be that way. I think that's more of a comment than a question. All right, so one of the conversations that one of the things that people are flagging is that sort of that conversation around transit of, we can make the push to potentially get people into sort of, hybrid vehicles or electric cars, but when it comes to we need to, extend the T, add trains to commuter rail, get east-west rail to even go farther. How does that end up, at what point does that, again, I guess maybe we're actually just making the argument that it sort of illustrates that individualism coming up against the collective.
Yeah, and I think, those are the kinds of big types of structural change, of doing, and there's a lot of questions. What is the best type of transit to actually produce equitable solutions and that are like environmentally sound, that are challenging, but I do think it's like sort of doing something for the collective good that have been really, really hard to sort of fight. And that's another place that, like in suburban communities across the country, efforts to extend public transportation have just been really, really fierce. And it'll be interesting to see if that sort of, if that can change, but it's been not forthcoming very much recently. So, and now, I think there's actually a big issue too, because in the pandemic, like, mass transit ridership is way down. And so what this will, if that's a temporary difference, but a permanent difference, but I think that like, it might make it even harder to make that argument.
Yeah. Jonathan, I forget, are we going to 8? I think we're going to 8, right? We've lost Jonathan.
Yes, I'm here. Okay. You can keep going.
Okay, I didn't want to cut people off. Right. So and then you ended up with, as Emma's saying here, then we had it sort of cycling on itself, because then you had service cuts, and then it became less convenient to actually use it, and then it sort of becomes a self-perpetuating problem. I feel like one of the questions that I should ask, particularly because sort of Jonathan opened the conversation with that, is I know there's a lot of people on here who already are working or will be working on the Fair Share Amendment, right? So actually passing effectively a surcharge on those who are the highest wealth getters in Massachusetts. How do you see that fitting into that sort of, the array of what are the issues in which you can actually necessarily get the suburban areas mobilized, and what kinds of arguments potentially might be most successful?
Well, I do think there's been a fascinating thing about the support for Elizabeth Warren within affluent educated suburban communities, who essentially is like one of the biggest supporters of something like the wealth tax. And I think that thinking about who that is going to impact, like that, that the effect of this type, I think there's a couple of things. Like, I do think there are suburban, to not just hate on all people who live in the suburbs, like there are many affluent suburban people who like do believe that they do believe in a redistributive system to some degree. So I think you can mobilize those people. I also think there's a sense of like the wealthiest of people and corporations should not be having the sort of the extensive tax breaks and should be paying more in taxes that they do. And I think that can be appealing to some degree. I think also this question of like, what are the benefits of doing it? And what will be like the personal benefits to you of doing this? And that's one of the things, like, I think, like one of the issues I think that can galvanize a lot of suburban voters to some degree are the kinds of community stuff on healthcare, because there's a lot of people, there's like a lot of frustration with the healthcare system. And so this thing of like, can we get like drugs to be more affordable? Like, so even the wealthiest people probably are like, I'm paying too much of my copay for my prescription drugs. I don't know. I mean, maybe like, but like, this is absurd. Like, why am I paying this much for my copay? And that could be something that actually does get a lot of people mobilized. So I'm trying to think of issues like that, that I think you can sort of say, like, there's something, I mean, it's even in the name that like, there's something unfair about this. We want to sort of create a correction to it, has power. And I do think that's a sort of argument that can work.
And also Jonathan just gave you the link again. So if you haven't already signed, make sure that you do that, because he's going to have us all door knocking by the time we get done here. I guess I wondered, the other thing is that sort of one of the things that struck me is because of the kind of heightened energy around a lot of the conversations that we've been having, particularly around education during the pandemic. And I'm sure you've seen sort of this wave of, I'll call it nonsense, given this crowd. This wave of nonsense been coming out around CRT and elementary schools, and sort of, are we talking about equity, or are we talking about racial diversity, or that kind of thing? And I guess one question I would have for you is, because all of these conversations are, because of the way that school districts are in Massachusetts, very hyper localized, and are also very emotional. What kinds of sort of what reflections would you have on that in light of what you learned in writing the book? And then, what kinds of advice maybe can you offer? Because I know there's a couple of people on here who are going to be facing those in their local committees coming up this fall.
I mean, it's such, I do think, and this is another one of like, when you get to people talking about what is being taught to for kids. And I know my mom sent me something. I don't follow in the ins and outs of Massachusetts politics that closely, but some like woman who was like very clearly like a suburban liberal, or liberal, like was supported, is like leading the campaign on this, of like against like having these things be taught in schools, in various different ways. Like, I want to have control of my own child, what my own child learns, or certain things are okay, but like it can't go too far, and then it goes into indoctrination. I just think, I mean, again, the benefits for your child to learn this, like, and that it's good for every kid. It's good for students of color to feel represented, and it's good for your child to learn these types of things. And like kind of the ways that it's been sort of targeted is really challenging. I mean, I think one of the one things that I've seen as a fear that actually fits very much in line with what I looked at in my book is that this is going to affect my kids' chances to get into a good college. Like, that there's this sense of like things are opening up in a way, and there's just things. I mean, I guess because I teach at the college level, but I think that there's so much anxiety around like kids getting into college, and I think this is very true in affluent suburban communities, and that like that's no longer that like I went to Yale, and like maybe my kid won't go. I'm giving a really like vulgar description of this, but like I'm not gonna be able to do that. Like, my kid might not have that same opportunity to do that, and that's not fair because I'm like doing all the right things. I think that it's for whatever. I think that the CRT debate is rubbing up against that. In various different, in some kind of capacity. And I don't know the solution to that. Like, I don't have the crystal ball. It's just something that I have noticed. I think it's a really, really difficult thing right now. I mean, my understanding, like, I think of this more because of being a history professor, that there's often these perennial debates about how history is taught. Like this, to me, it's very reminiscent of the standards debates of the early 90s. And I think it's like, a real, I guess how I think about it is it's such a distraction, and it's like a distraction from a lot of other issues. And so it's not to say that it's not really important, and it's really important that kids are taught about racial equity in schools. But I think that the question that I would have if I was on a school committee is like, why aren't we talking about other things? Like, why aren't we talking about like funding issues or something? I mean, there's so many other questions that I think are really, really important, that should be addressed by a school committee, and this, just to give it this disproportionate weight, is I just think it's really challenging. So that's why, if I was doing it, I would just try to shift the discussion, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, and I know there's a couple of, we've got a couple of school committees represented on here who are either in the middle of this or seeing it coming. I think the way that you framed that is interesting, though, in terms of if this is seen as a fear of college attainment, which I think you're absolutely right, that particularly in many of these communities, that's kind of it, of, where's your kid going to college is the kind of the whole story. That if the messaging from the college level is, or the messaging from the school district about what the colleges expect instead becomes reframed to, this is what the colleges are going to expect your child to have known or experienced or whatever, that actually, to flip it again into that, there's actually a benefit to your kid kind of conversation.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think those are appealing to people. So
all right, there, yeah, so we're gonna need to Jonathan, right. In 2016, in the election sense, we've seen a real shift in the voting patterns of white, affluent, postgraduate educated suburbanites, in no small part a reaction against Trump. Do you think that change will be enduring? And what will be the dynamic between how such voters' views change after changing voting patterns versus how the party and candidates change in response to the reconstituted electorate?
So I think it's a great question. And I think there are two pieces of it. On the one hand, it's an issue of the Republican Party, basically. And if the Republican Party's decision about to sort of maintain its kind of Trump-centered focus. I think if that happens, that like moderate suburbanites will be this, reliable, will continue to support the Democratic Party. I think that if like you have another, if a sort of moderate wing of the party reasserts itself, that is like I don't think that you'd have a Charlie Baker running could win the presidential nomination for the Republicans, but like a figure like that, like even Mitt Romney to some degree, or a slightly chastened Mitt Romney than he ran in 2012, that would win over moderate suburbanites. I think that the other question is this bigger issue within the Democrats and like its like their question of kind of where they want to spend resources. And I think there's this real tension. This is like a fundamental tension that the Democratic Party has just been grappling with about where its priorities go. And I think one of the issues is that suburban voters are have seemed like a safe and effective path. So that has sort of been, and it's been seen played out. But I think that there's really long-term costs for that for other types of groups and other types of groups feeling represented by the party. And I think personally, I think 2020 was such an anomaly for so many reasons, but it did not produce a stable coalition, and these tensions and fractions will continue to persist. So I think that it's a sort of issue of like, the real costs to sort of making suburban voters the center of your political and policy strategy that the Democratic Party sort of needs to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, for example, seeing, the debate during the Democratic primary over, if we had, for example, the sort of, the quote unquote, the Democrats can always count on Black voters in particular places. If they were trending towards Biden, then what did that mean for people who were seen as more progressive candidates? And that, to me, it seems to illustrate some of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, and I think I think that some of it is taking for granted particular types of things. So if I'm not a Democratic strategist, so I'm just a like history professor. But the places that I see it is around voter outreach. So not taking it for granted, but actually doing sustained voter outreach and grassroots voter outreach within marginalized communities has a major impact. The other one is like working at the state level and not giving up particular things. I think the Democrats have a massive issue of focusing way too much on presidential elections to detriments of other types of things, and especially working at the state, and then also at the I think there's been movement at the level of the congressional level. Mm-hmm. But those kinds of pushes need to happen in other places, not just in terms of presidential politics.
Mm-hmm. Which I guess it goes back to sort of some of the point that you made in the book, and that we sort of made in other contexts, which is the sort of the types of Democrats that end up at the Massachusetts State House, both in terms of leadership and also in terms of direction of who is it that they are actually representing, and who is it that they're necessarily speaking to.
Yeah. And so that's some of the things. I mean, it's that you sort of make trade-offs, and it's not just like Democrats at all costs, because that can lead to other types of, that can have long-term other kinds of consequences.
Right. So I think, Margaret, we did the question of sort of the pitch in the suburbs being about, for fair share, being about that question of kind of self-benefit, but also that you're hitting the highest earners in this actually potentially being able to appeal to kind of larger questions of literal fairness. Is that represent, I think?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so, all right. And we're getting a lot of sort of individual stories of over housing in particular communities.
I mean, I think a bigger issue too is the questions of like law. I mean, so with the questions around affordable housing, is I saw just briefly, I'm terrible at reading chats at the same time. I have like my Zoom ability. I don't have the Zoom multi abilities. But whenever my students are like writing in the chat, I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I can't control this. What I would say is one of the things I think it's a great idea to like have, I mean, to require multi-use developments. And I think that I know that in a lot of, I don't know the details in Massachusetts about working, in California, there's been a lot of efforts to kind of push towards that type of development. And I think there's a lot to it. I think the biggest issue is enforcement. And so, I mean, this is the thing about like things like the anti-stop zoning law, or a lot of the things that get passed just don't get enforced. And so I think it's actually the pressure of actually making those things come to task, because it's one thing to pass a law about zoning, it's another to actually make it work. And I think that at all, actually, this is like the local, the state and the federal level is just time and time again, these sort of housing policies just do not get enforced at the way that they should be. And that's a major issue. And so some of it is in a couple of ways, I think pressure to make that happen, but also like state capacity and just like certain resources where resources are spent to actually make sure that these things are being put into place. So that's my like bigger pitch too, of like campaigns or issues to work on.
And Jonathan is making then a segue to your upcoming book, which we should absolutely obviously be talking about too. That some of this is also that sort of pitching the idea of market-based solutions to social problems. So can you talk about that in terms of housing?
Sure. I mean, well, so I'm finishing a second book that's about that's called Left Behind: How the Democrats Failed to Solve Inequality. And it's looking at, particularly in the 80s and 90s, the Democratic Party especially under Clinton, turning towards market-based solutions to solve poverty and inequality, and the role of those policies and kind of limiting and really sort of draining the social welfare state, or sort of standing in for a social welfare state, so the market can sort of take the role of social welfare, and how these became the kind of dominant ideas of the Democratic Party, that so especially on the ideology of doing well by doing good. And housing is actually one of the critical pieces of it. And what happened to public housing in the United States, which is basically it's in some ways like non-existent. I mean, there's been a real restriction of building of public housing, and replacing it with programs like Hope 6, which is mixed income housing. So there's the is it Orchard Street project in Boston as an example, is the Hope 6 project. But these programs have oftentimes been beneficial to developers, and many of them offer market rate apartments to various different people. They've been less good at housing people, and I think have created like a massive they've created a massive shortage in public and affordable housing. And I know this is a huge issue in places like Boston. I mean, which is just, I was recently, since I live in California, but was back visiting, just as like so egregiously unaffordable right now. And so what those types of programs have done. So I think in some ways there's a lot of discussion around like, how do we do affordability? But I think some of it's actually rebuilding public housing, which has not been done since in any meaningful way since the 1970s in the United States. So that's like a big question about like actually building units. And that's both a suburb question, but that's also just a everywhere question, that like there has to be more public and affordable housing. So that's my other bellywicker. I just made a rant.
We appreciate it. No, and I think, I mean, there's certainly so much conversation that's going on in the chat. I know that there's a lot of people who've been working on affordable housing and accessible housing and all of those kinds of issues, certainly out towards Boston. But I mean, honestly, it's coming up a lot, an increasing amount here in Worcester. As some of you may have heard, we have a bit of a baseball stadium downtown now. And what that has done in terms of the allergy that my city has to the word gentrification, first of all, is quite something, but the actual impact that then is having on families. And then, I mean, as everybody knows here, you know, every other kind of policy ends up being education policy by the time you get done. So once you've made it much less stable for people to live in particular places and rent starts rising and they have to move around, you've then destabilized the educational system too. So yeah, that's definitely relevant. Whether or not we actually managed to have the CDC signing emergency eviction bills. You all keep wanting to talk about malls. We keep coming back to malls. I don't know. Is there a question that I missed? I'm trying to figure out whether or not there's actually any questions that I missed. Nobody wants to live over a mall. People want to live over a mall. Of course, one of the things that Worcester did is we actually knocked down our mall after we had spent some time building it. There was another question that happened in passing. I mean, I guess something that we should ask you is what other things are you, besides housing, what other kinds of issues then are you drawing on in your new book that sort of, I mean, it sounds to me as if this is actually almost a continuation of the same story, just not necessarily focused in the same places.
Yeah, I mean, the book sort of emerged from the last chapter of the project of looking at all these Democrats who sort of embrace the market as solutions. So Dukakis is like the kind of early example of that, but the figures were kind of like Atari Democrats who are part of the Democratic Leadership Council. So how those ideas became so dominant to the Democratic Party. And so what that means, and sort of this idea of kind of using the market and this faith in the market to do good. And I think that that's a kind of real figure of Democratic, and also in Massachusetts state. I mean, I think this is another thing where you see sort of moderate Republicans, but like this embrace of things like public-private solutions and public-private partnerships, and like market-based ideology, just being really, really prevalent. So that's something that I'm thinking, or I have thought a lot about, of what that sort of means to the Democratic Party. And policy, and how it's contributed to driving inequality. So I'm looking; it's a more national story, but affects Massachusetts in various different ways.
Yeah, and I think there's people who are bringing up charter schools in the chat. I mean, I know that we all have.
Yeah, and there's I have a chapter on charter schools, and actually, the interesting question that looks at that relates to this is the preview of it, and I hope I will come back and talk again. The book, or do anything I can to help, But I looked at actually how that Silicon Valley played a key role in promoting charter schools. And so people like the founder of Netflix, who had become big charter proponents, but like why and how their ideas became so sort of prevalent. And especially the creation of an organization called the New School Ventures Fund, which was started by John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins, so one of the big venture capital funds, but was actually big on the charter management company. So like looking at the growth of charter schools, that actually the tech industry played a sort of major role in it. And it's not necessarily, one of the things I find really interesting is it wasn't necessarily that they were want to make money off of it. A lot of it has to do with the idea that this was going to is a more efficient mechanism for producing education, and that this idea of sort of producing better workers for the tech industry leads to those types of things, but played a big idea in sort of bringing charters to scale in all kinds of ways. So that's a sort of fascinating continuation of the book. And that was actually surprising. I didn't realize that the tech industry had played, the kind of Mark Zuckerberg later story, but I actually hadn't realized at the foundations of charter schools, the role of both. Clinton was a huge charter proponent, but then at the same time, the tech industry, and those kind of work hand in hand. So that's another thing. I also become really interested in philanthropy and its role, which has all kinds of implications for education. So that's another place of where my brain is going right now.
Yeah. And by the way, for those of you who might be looking for aha moments for the current Massachusetts political scheme. Our current Secretary of Education, Jim Pizer, came from the New School Venture Fund.
Oh, did he really? Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know. That's fascinating.
That was why I picked up my phone to double check, because I was like, my memory says that that's actually. So yes, another one of those where like, wait, you mentioned the New School Venture Fund. That's Jim Pizer. Yes.
Yeah, and there's all kinds. I mean, that's this like the sort of the tentacles of those types of those programs are really predominant. So that's what I'm trying to understand.
And it's, I mean, also from my perspective, at least, it's another great illustration of sort of, what do you have in your mind of the Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Like, who should that person be? What should their goals be? What should their vision be of education? And it's someone who came out of the New School Ventures Fund. Like, those are not necessarily sort of two things that you necessarily would think together. But again, I think it's part of that technocratic kind of solution question.
Absolutely.
There was someone asked a question. Oh, so someone asked a question as to whether or not you had any, whether or not you thought the town meeting model had any impact on any of sort of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the sort of history of Massachusetts, but I think this like localized dimension. So it's really interesting, because I think in some ways the town meeting style is democracy in action, and there's particular power in that, but I think at the same time can allow for certain kinds of dysfunction to happen, and especially when you have 100 town meetings working, that it doesn't allow for kind of cross types of collaboration. But I'm curious, it's a really important space for people to get organized. I think oftentimes it's sort of just who can control the conversation, and so it's like. This came up in the book a little bit, but I think I see this happen in my own watching, is where I live in a community in LA where there's a really fierce fight. There's been an ongoing fight about building a big bus route to go through that would help rapid bus trips. And for years and years, they don't always fight about it. But hundreds of people in opposition will show up to the meeting. So so it actually comes across. So we're actually having the same issue. And then the other big one right now is also is around building temporary housing for unhoused people. And 500 people will show up at the meeting in opposition to it, but oftentimes people for it don't show up to the meetings and things like that. So I think that it's a place where democracy happens, but it can also often be distorted by loudest voices. And so that affects I think has had an effect in some ways on the types of issues that how they get manifest.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're gonna ask.
I wouldn't say that means don't go to your town meeting, because no,
I mean, arguably it means you really should go to your town meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the other thing. Go and show up and go every week and hear what people are saying. And so that goes to me too.
That's what I've been saying also to people at school committees of there's always people who are shouting about how we don't want to whatever, and you should make sure.
Yeah, I know. It's my no, and it's getting the best signs and things like that. It's there's a lot of organizing, but yeah, I think that's right. That it's about going and continuing to sort of speak those types of things.
So I'm going to take Joel's question as the final one. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on recent national conversations around voting rights, particularly with liberal factions in mind. I'm thinking in part about the White House suggesting recently that it's possible to out-organize voter suppression.
I think it's a really interesting issue. And I thought about this actually, of the issues that I looked at in the book, voting rights was not a major one. Or thinking about democracy being threatened was not an issue that suburban liberals ever thought, because they were represented in the democracy, in the sort of in the faction, or always felt like voting wasn't a thing. And I think it's also really fascinating, actually. I mean, the thing that I would think about organizing around, and this is only coming out, is as I said, one of the reasons that suburban at the national level, and I think at the local level too, or the state level, suburban liberals get so much attention is they disproportionately vote. So that's why the Democratic Party has devoted so much time to this particular kind of constituency, is that they're the highest, they have the highest voter turnout. So if that feels threatened in any capacity, it might be something to kind of to move on. So I think that it would be a really important thing. I think thinking institutionally about how that operates, and I do think the resources are there and available. So I'd like to see, I was thinking of this I brought my daughter to, this is right at the pediatrician today, and so some people had I was noticing people had masks that say vote, and that's one way of showing your support for voting, but what are the other way, what are the other ways that because I was just thinking about the signifying of voting and saying the encouraging of voting, but other types of ways that can actually be really powerfully moved could do something. So that's another place. If you've ended, I was feeling like I was being depressing, but that gives me a sense of hope.
I figured we could take it out on that. We've got lots of organizers here. Jonathan, I'm going to turn it back over to you. This has been great.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. Can we get a kind of a round of applause for both of them? Those who want to kind of indicate applause so much. I think this has been a great conversation. Very informative about thinking about kind of our own history here, as well as ways of constructively moving forward. And I know I look forward to reading Dr. Geismer's new book when that comes out, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to bring you back for a discussion of that and its implications. And wanted to thank everybody. Wanted to again thank both of you for kind of the great discussion, and thank everybody who joined us this evening, because the chat has been very lively and engaged as well, and contributed a lot to it. So thank you again, and hope to see you at events soon.
Thanks for doing this. This has been great.